Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have another invigorating and incredible episode for you guys. So sit back and enjoy. And today, guess what we're going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about the Iran war, of course, as this is still the biggest news in the world today and still driving conversation and thoughts that we need to discuss. And so I got some questions about it from Nitro and Gillis Enjoyer, so I will be covering their questions in the opening segment on this. And I guess our opening segment is to, I had a thought about tweeting out like Operation Epic Fury, more like Operation Epic Fail. I decided not to do that because I haven't tweeted this like 2 years ago, but the state of social media is horrible that people are not going to understand this. We'll talk about this maybe a little bit later on. I mean, we're having to deal with people earnestly posting about how the fate of white men in 2026 is worse than that of slaves, and I had to politely disagree with that. But the state of our discourse is a lot like Gab. And if you ever had the misfortune of ever being on Gab for a little bit, Gab, you would go on there, and there's still humor to be found on Twitter and people to like make jokes, but there's a more dead serious autism that's on there that was very much common with Gab, and it's like kind of histrionic anger, more of rather than a jaded shit poster. The defining trait is more like a BPD woman, borderline personality disorder woman, where they're just like shrieking and hysteria and angry at everything. And they choose to misread your post in the most ungenerous fashion possible. And so they're not going to be happy with that. So I probably wouldn't do that because, one, it is a lame joke, but it's still like one of those ironic jokes I like to do. But people aren't going to do that. But there is a way to say that it is Operation Epic Fail. As I've always said, took the stance of wait and see. My main point is being pro-Trump and hoping it turns out the best. But this is not turning out well for Trump. As I posted over the weekend, we're not going to achieve regime change. We've now ended up with a government that is even more hostile to making a nuclear deal. Our coalition, the willing we had, is all got cold feet and wants this to end, except for Israel. It's pretty much just us and Israel. We even have fewer allies in this than we did in Iraq War, and certainly far fewer allies than we did in the first Gulf War. It's just us and Israel. Everybody else wants this to end. It's us and Israel versus Iran. Now, no one's really coming to rush to Iran's aid, but no one's helping us out either. So, and everyone wants this to end. No one wants the Gulf states that were encouraging us to do this have now got second thoughts and want this to end. Europe is taking a major hit on this, as is the entire Middle East, and they all want it to end. Pretty much only Israel and Iran want this to continue because, and even Trump does, is like you could see just Trump's wild posting on this. One of the questions I think it actually came from Gillis Enjoyer, wondering about my thoughts about Trump saying we're opening up negotiations. Well, Iran's denying it. But Trump's like posting on this is just all over the place. He's threatening to destroy their power grids. He's threatening to go after their oil supplies. Now he's talking about negotiations. Trump himself knows it has not gone the way he planned, because when they did this, not so much regime change, they thought they could have a new government in place that would be less ideological and more willing to make a deal. Part of the elements of the Don Road doctrine or Trump's foreign policy doctrine is the ideas that the world is composed of people who are motivated primarily by pragmatism or by monetary reasons or monetary motivations. And so this is guiding the world. And what we can do is that once we realize that everyone just wants to make deals and to make more money, when you operate on that way, you can reach more agreements and have diplomacy. That was our thinking in Venezuela, where we took out Maduro and hopefully got someone who would be more amenable to us. And it appeared that person would be more amenable to us, but now maybe that's not quite the case. We have these thoughts in Cuba. We have these thoughts. It's especially true of our dealings with Putin, where we're not treating Putin as, this ideological anti-Westerner, or whatever, or some bastion of traditionalism, or whatever ideology you want to have, but more of a guy who just wants to make deals and have his interests secured. It's a very interest-based foreign policy that ignores most of the value-based foreign policy that we've had before, and imagines that the world's guided by all these businessmen who just want to make deals. It's also why he gets along with more strongmen, is that they have more power of maneuver than democracies, and they're less. Most of these autocrats and strongmen are less beholden to ideology. That's why he gets along with MBS and a lot of these guys in the Middle East and elsewhere, because they all just want to cut deals and figure out ways to make money. And in a lot of ways, it's a better way of going about the world than having, this idea that, like, we're in a battle between autocracies and liberal democracies, and us trying to promote our values and liberal democracy all over the world. It's very disastrous and not stabilizing, to say the least. So this is better. But then when we confront committed ideologists and people who are fanatics, the Trump doctrine doesn't work. So Iran, these guys are firmly committed to an ideology. Also, they feel that they have been shamed because they've had their leader killed right before their eyes, and they're not just like, okay, well, I guess we just want to get around to making money. No, they want to avenge that dishonor that has been done to them. And Trump doesn't really know how to deal with that. And we're also dealing with ideological fanatics in Israel, which they've managed to convince the Trump administration, that there's like business to be had, but they're also firmly committed to an ideology. And so we're dealing with these two fanatics that are not guided by business principles, but guided by ideological goals. And the Trump foreign policy doesn't really know what to do here. Not to say that anyone else did, but previous foreign policies wouldn't have gone for such a radical action as assassinating Khamenei because Israel asked us to, which is also a problem with the war, is that we could sustain this war effort with the hit to gas prices and other things if there was a reason. We have no reason for this war. Besides, like, when we ask about it, it's like, oh, well, they were planning an attack. But it's like so half-hearted that no one believes that. And then the only thing that there is like the frank moments of honesty when they're like, well, Israel's going to attack us this anyway. And we blew up we attacked their military capabilities in order to make it their response less bad. Which you could argue that we would have far more American casualties and maybe more damage to the Gulf states if we had not, targeted their military facilities and damaged that. And despite, what a lot of people think, even though this is a pickle, is Iran's military capabilities are severely weakened by the war. The number of strikes that they're launching have gone down. They're not as effective as we thought they could be. There's that, but they don't need that. They've shut down the Strait of Hormuz. That's their main trump card, and it's working. They don't quite need to be firing at Riyadh and all this and cause massive damage and just wipe Israel off the map and kill a bunch of American soldiers to deliver a message. They're already delivering that message, and so it's a major problem for us. So we're having to deal with that, the problems with Iran, and we're in this pickle. And unlike the first Gulf War, I'm going to bring up the first Gulf War. The first Gulf War, we had a similar thing. It's where 2 weeks in, everyone's complaining that this hasn't. When we first started our air campaign, and we initially tried to just do an air campaign to convince the Iraqis to retreat from Kuwait, and it didn't work. Which is also going to happen here, is that we're trying to do a purely air naval campaign to convince the Iranians to make a nuclear deal, but they don't want to do that. And it didn't work in the first Gulf War, and that's why we had to use ground troops. And we are not going to use ground troops because that's insanely unpopular, and it's going to create a ton of casualties. And would likely have to require congressional authorization. We're not going to do that. We're not going to have that. And Trump knows that would destroy him in the midterms and in 2028. He wants out of this. So, but in the first Gulf War, we had a coalition willing. We had sold this to the public. We're, we convinced people that Saddam is the new Hitler. He was not, but it worked. We had a moral reason for this. Here we have no reason. In the Iraq we had a reason, even though it turned out to be bullshit, of saying, well, Saddam is supporting Al Qaeda and he's building a bomb and he's going to deliver a bomb or chemical weapons to the terrorists, so we have to stop him. And that convinced enough Americans that we had to. And we had 9/11 motivating this. There's just no motivation for this. And the thing is like America is so powerful that we aren't that bothered by this. I have this analogy. It doesn't quite work, but I imagine you're the only lawn care guy for a neighborhood. You're the only possible lawn care guy. That's America. And there's a weed that they have a problem with. It's a minor problem, but they like to get rid of it. Well, we come out with a new experimental weed killer and we utilize it. The problem is it may deplete the weed, but it also kills all the lawns of these people. Now, the people are pissed that it's killed their lawns, but there's no other choice besides you, America, to provide lawn care services. So we could just say, whoops, and go about our business. And it also doesn't affect our lawn. That is what I think of a lot of this as with the Iran strike, is that we go out, Iran is a problem for the region. The Gulf states, not only does Israel doesn't like them, the Gulf states don't like Iran. Turkey has its problems with Iran. It is a problem within the region. And it's a problem for us as well. And, they are the major state backer of terrorism. Now, that terrorism isn't directed so much to us, but to Israel. And Israel wants to eliminate support for these terror groups, both Hezbollah and Hamas, that is primarily coming from Iran. So it is an issue, but we do something. We try out an experiment to see if it will work, and it does not work. It doesn't have the effect we imagine. And it screws up with everyone else, Europe, Middle East, elsewhere. But it doesn't really affect us. We have, we can deal with the rise in gas prices. Now, people get annoyed by that, but it's not creating mass suffering here. We're able to get away with this. This is not going to end the American empire, even if we take the humiliation of this. And really, we're at right now that we're going to have to do, if Trump's going to do negotiations, the negotiations are going to have to be making concessions. Now, the Iranians, their demands is that we leave the Persian Gulf. We're not going to leave the Persian Gulf. That is too much of a humiliation. Maybe we could draw down troop levels in Iraq, something like that. But the main concessions we're going to have to do is to withdraw sanctions. And we're already starting to experiment with that, with buying Iranian oil. Now we're trying to do that to lower gas prices, but it's opening something that, like, hey, something we haven't done in 30 years, we're going to be doing. Maybe we might do this if you open up the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to have to reach a diplomatic. We're going to have to do diplomacy for this. The regime is going to stay there. It's almost military. It's extremely difficult by military means to open the Strait of Hormuz, and we are not willing to risk the casualties. And there's no public support for this war effort in the first place, much less if there's one for where it's going to get hundreds of Americans killed and a greater escalation. And Trump is just trying to figure out any way to get. The problem is that if he offers these concessions, it's going to look like a defeat. Now, he can claim military victory by saying, like, well, we sunk their Navy no longer exists, their missile capabilities are significantly reduced, their leadership is in disarray. Maybe he can claim that. But offering any concessions is going to be seen as a step down. And it's going to, leave a mark on America. It's going to embarrass us. But people will forget about it. Iranians will be happy with it. That's it. I don't even think it would be as much of an embarrassment as, say, during the Lebanese War of 2006, when Israel invaded Lebanon to attack Hezbollah and then they drew back. That was much more of an obvious Hezbollah victory than us making concessions. Because at the end of the day, Iran still got punked here. They lost their leader. They lost several of their leaders. Their Navy no longer exists. Not that the Navy was that important, and they've also lost significant military capabilities. And they've been, they have had their sky controlled by their enemies. That's still embarrassing for them, but they still, by surviving, they still get a win, and also, wringing concessions for America that would stand as a win. But that's all the way to solve this. I think we're not going to achieve the objectives we set out unless with greater escalation, and greater escalation is stupid. Now, the problems that we have is Israel wants to ensure we don't have the diplomatic conference. Both Israel and Iran want to make it hard for us for different reasons. Iran wants to get as many concessions as possible, primarily kicking America out of the Persian Gulf. That is too much of a defeat for us to accept, and we're not going to do that. Maybe something over in Iraq we could make a deal on, but we're not going to leave the Middle East. The more thing is that we're going to lay off the sanctions, and maybe say to other countries that they can start buying more Iranian oil and do business there. And they're not going to face any repercussions. There's a lot of things we can do, and we're going to probably have to do that to end the conflict. We tried to experiment. It didn't work. As we say with wait and see, I think the only way to have a change is to escalate, but the escalation could cause even more damage to the global economy. Iran has already shown that they're going to attack oil facilities in Qatar and elsewhere to further damage global oil supply and make the Gulf states even more terrified over the war and more, willing to cut any type of deal to end it. That could potentially say that they're kicking us out. So I don't think it's necessary to have the concession. And Israel's still trying to do regime changes. Is that they still believe the protesters can come out and topple the government, which they're not going to do. Their country is under attack, and the people defending the country is the Islamic Republic. It's the IRGC and the mullahs. They're the ones standing up for their country. Generally, people don't, turn traitor in a moment of conflict like this. Because they're the ones having their cities bombed. And this even happened in World War II, where we thought that, if we're bombing German cities, we're going to demoralize the population. No, that actually made them more vengeful and hateful toward the Allies and established a degree of loyalty to the Third Reich, as they're the ones standing up. Now, it created anger at the Third Reich, too, for not being capable of defending them, but it didn't create we're now going to have a protest movement. It's like imagining we firebomb Dresden and then the survivors then trying to overthrow the Third Reich. That's the opposite of happening. So the people are rallying to the flag. They're not rallying to overthrow the regime. But they are hoping that by killing a lot of these leaders and people who would be involved in putting down protests, that they can, make it easier to topple. That's not going to happen. So we're going to have to make a deal. That's the end of it. And negotiations is the only way to solve this. I think it's my main goal is to ensure that Trump is, able to commit to his domestic agenda, and this is becoming a distraction from it. It's not Operation Epic Fury, it's Operation Epic Fail, but we can take the hit. We're so powerful that it doesn't have that major of a downside. So we'll continue on. We'll be stronger before, or not stronger than before. We'll take a little bit of embarrassment, but we'll move on. It's, look at what happened in Afghanistan. This was a major, major humiliation for us. The Afghanistan withdrawal. That would be more of a humiliation than what happens in Iran, because in Iran we still demonstrated our military capacity to kill and to do great damage. In Afghanistan, it showed us retreating from the world, which convinced Putin that we wouldn't defend Ukraine, which he was wrong about, and then he invaded Ukraine. And by the time of Ukraine, everyone had forgotten Afghanistan, except for a very specific type of conservatives, like the Abbey bombing. Like if you watch Fox News, they were over Christmas, they were obsessed with one of Trump's main accomplishments was getting the Abbey bombers. So it's what is Abbey? And then I realized that was the bombing that killed over a dozen troops in Afghanistan when we were leaving. But that was a full-scale humiliation and signaled that maybe the American empire is over, but it's not. Here, it would just signal that the American empire has limits on what it can do, and similar to what happened in Iraq, but with less cost to lives and treasure, it would be, a moral victory for Iran, but they would still, be limping and very wounded. They'd maybe have better ways of making money, but they'd still be a weak, isolated regime afterwards. So I think you just have to take it. It's done. American public isn't really. There's no argument for staying the course. Besides like Trump saying it or this isn't MAGA. And as long as this goes on, it more like the Trumpism merges into Mark Levin and stuff like that, which we don't want. So I think it's just time to cut the costs and just make a deal and to make the concessions. And we're going to have to do that. I think Iran would like to make more money again so they could stabilize the regime. But if they're making money, that's also acknowledgement that we're not going to have regime change. But who gives a shit? I don't care about regime change. I think keeping Iran neutralized and weak is important, but not at the risk of other things. So, or not important, but there's American interest in it, but it is what it is. So that is it. As I've said, I've always had wait and see, but we're heading into the fourth week. It doesn't seem to be getting better, and I think as we could see from Trump's post, as he realizes this was a mistake, and pretty much only Israel thinks this is really good because they, if they had regime change in Iran, that would end support for their main problems. That would end support for Hezbollah and Hamas. They would still exist, but without the funding that they had before, and a much weaker, and they would pretty much eliminate all their enemies. They don't have Assad anymore, and Hezbollah and Hamas are very weak right now. And if they got rid of Iran, that eliminates all their enemies. Huge win for them. But they actually have a reason for that. But America doesn't. So it's time to end it. Iran is not going to be our friend. I do think that's like rather stupid where people are like, why don't we become friends with Iran? Well, first off, it's not just us. It's not like Iranians want to be friends. It's like anti-Americanism, as I've said in many podcasts and even my podcast on American-Iran relations. It is fundamental to the regime. And it's also not going to wipe away all these conflicts and issues we've had with Iran over the last 50 years. And it also would not just cause problems with Israel. It's like, we just dump Israel and then we're friends with Iran. And now we get this huge advantage. No, we're also dumping our relations with the Gulf states as well to just be friends with Iran, which doesn't even like us. And most of their hardliners don't want a friendly relation with us. And they're not going to want a friendly relation with us after this either. So, we killed their leader. We helped kill their leader. That's not going to happen. So I'm not to there, but you just got to make concessions. That's my point. It's time to wrap it up. We don't have the major amount of casualties, but it's Americans are paying. High gas prices is always something immediately felt, and Americans feel from week to week. And if you have like a 50-cent rise in prices, which is around the same with me, my area, even a little bit more, people notice that and they get pissed. They get annoyed. And if that lasts for the rest of the year, that's going to impact voting. I think the midterms are already not going to be so hot for Republicans, but, if you have really bad economic changes, we're going to lose the Senate, which is really bad. So keeping the Senate is enough of a goal to wrap this up. And we're not going to achieve, what goals do we want to achieve? We're not going to achieve regime change, and we're not going to convince them to make a more generous offer on the nuclear deal. That's it. You can say we got a nuclear deal thing. It's like, we traded concessions in favor of you guys promising not to fire any more rockets at Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE. Okay, great. And Oman. That's it. Okay, great. We won. Just take that and move on. So that is my thoughts on the latest with Iran. Yeah, in concluding thoughts, I think, it's wait and see, but Epic Fury didn't accomplish its goals. And really right now we're just trying to have the most positive ending we can imagine. We're just trying to extricate ourselves from a bigger disaster. We're not, the goal was to at least get leadership in there that would be more amenable to America. We're not going to get that. And we're not going to topple the regime. And they're weakened, but they're strong enough to what it matters to block the Strait of Hormuz, and no one wants to risk their navies and militaries to unblock it. So that is what it is. That's what's going on. So we've got some other questions. Got a lot of questions with Cesar Chavez, but I'll start off with Robert Mueller. Is Dollar Bill asked about this? He said, Robert Mueller has died. Can you share your thoughts about the cult of Mueller during Trump's first term? Liberals deride Trump as a huckster for selling coins, watches, and Bibles during the 2024 campaign. But in 2018, they were buying Mueller votive candles, Mueller-themed children's books, and Mueller time baseball caps and T-shirts. Yeah, people forget resistance liberalism of the 2010s. I mean, this is something I really need to write, is how people have just forgotten about the 2010s with us. It's like, I have my article yesterday about, Trumpism. And then they're like, there are no differences between the pre-Trump GOP and the Trump GOP. Well, morons say this because they have no memory. As I always argue, is that voters have the memories of goldfish. And even a lot of online right people who supposedly pay attention to the news have the memories of goldfish. And in a lot of ways, it's intentional because they have a black pill fetish and they want to feel that they've been betrayed. It's like, oh, Trump betrayed me again. A lot of these guys, they want to imagine that they're sitting in the cuck chair and Trump is like, once again, betraying them with Israel, and they're just watching it, and they're like, oh, I'm so angry about this. I just can't stop sitting in my chair and imagining this. Or he's like cheating on them with 1 billion Indian migrants that are coming. All these people have these, and they get off to it. So that's part of the selective memory with that. But the Mueller stuff it's something that everyone has wanted to forget. Is liberals want to forget about it because they want to forget the resistance cringe that was popular at that time. They want to pretend it didn't exist. You get a lot of people who just imagine that there was none of this because there was like Avenatti there was all these hucksters. There was like Michael Avenatti who was like a hero, and then he went to jail for a variety of crimes. He was clearly like a con artist. He was briefly a hero. They had all the type of the hysteric news coverage that was popular on CNN, Washington Post, like democracy dies in darkness. I still think that's the motto of Washington Post, but they established all this stuff. And it's like Trump first term wasn't doing anything. But they were all imagining they were living under a fascist regime. Today, I think a lot of the fantasy stuff is more with our side rather than the left, because the online sphere, or at least X or Twitter, is mostly dominated by the right, so it becomes a fantasy sphere for us where we go on and log on, and it's World of Warcraft. In the 2010s, it was much more liberals who were logging on. The economy is doing great. They're not getting rounded up. None of this fascism that they thought would happen is happening. But they imagined that by online, and they imagined that they were living in 1935 Germany when they were living in 2018 America. And so Mueller became, this godsend. Is like, this is the guy who's going to bring down the fascist regime. And he's a Chad white guy. When the pictures, he looked like he had everything together. He's a tough talking guy. He's a former Marine officer. He's going to bring down Trump. And he's a part of the resistance intelligence. This is also the time where they began talking about how awesome the CIA and FBI is, and that there are true heroes. And the left went from, attacking the CIA to then saluting the CIA. They love the deep state. And Mueller was the embodiment of it. And the thing is, Mueller wasn't giving these interviews. All he did is he had the strong jaw, masculine features of this old man who wasn't going to take shit. And they just imagined this guy as, a powerful figure who's going to tell Trump to sit down, and he's going to be so intimidated by it. And when he gave his testimony, I think it was in 2019, about it, he was revealed as he was like senile. He was slurring his words. He didn't have everything together. I think he was an alcoholic from what I remember. So he was not this impressive figure. It was like this old guy, likely suffering from going senile, having a drinking problem, didn't really, was slurring his words, wasn't very impressive, wasn't showing any confidence. And it's all these like where people just have this image of this silent, tough guy who's not saying anything. They don't have his voice on record. He was able to imagine himself as this charismatic, strong man, white guy, which is something liberals still are into. It's like, anti-white racism is an important part of the left today, but the leaders they still cling to are these alpha white guys. What they want, and Mueller was a Republican, a moderate Republican, but not really quite a liberal, at least by pre-Trump standards. But they still want the Chad white guy to lead them. So why they like Biden, they like the Uncle Joe memes. There's still that fascination with Gavin Newsom and a few others. They still like the Chad white liberal leading them, and they did like that with Mueller. And so there was like a weird sexual cult around him too, and other stuff. But people have forgotten all this hysteria of the first term because people want to forget. Liberals want to forget because they know it was like very cringe and how they were going into hysterics every day over Trump's fascism. And also they're embarrassed by because a lot of their predictions are not a lot of predictions, but they have a lot of those talking points that they had in the 2010s are truer today with what Trump's able to get away with. Trump is doing a whole lot more in the second term, and a lot of it is some of these nightmares they had in the first term, both good and bad. He's able to do. He's able to launch a war. He's having these, ICE goon squads on the streets. He's trying to arrest his enemies. More of what they're saying is true about Trump today than it was 8 years ago. But, they wanted to believe it, and Mueller was their hero. So, yeah, Mueller, and it's also why there's this muted response to Mueller's death, is that they're like, oh, he inspired so much cringe that a lot of these liberals are like, yeah, we're kind of embarrassed by it. It's similar with how liberals reacted during COVID, like the lockdown hysteria. They all want to forget it. And the public itself wants to forget it with COVID hysteria because most people didn't react well in 2020 for a variety of reasons, and everyone wants to forget it. And it's the same with resistance stuff of the 2010s variety. People want to forget it. And the right isn't that eager to remember it either because most of what the right is upset about is internecine feuds. We're forgetting that the left exists today to just fight among ourselves. We pretend the left doesn't exist, that only our enemies are Trump or anti-Trump people. Like the left is just completely forgotten about in our worldview, mostly because we're not interacting with them anymore on social media. So we don't even have that eagerness to remember the left-wing cringe as much as we would have, a few years ago. So, yeah, the Mueller cult was insane, but this is all, if you ever turn on MSNBC, CNN, and the major news networks, they were all going in on Mueller. It's the same with Avenatti and a lot of other figures. It was a strange time. The one thing is, like, news media is, like, more objective now than it was in 2026. Like, I remember reading New York Times stuff in 2020, and it would just be straight, like, op-eds as a straight news story. It's like, Trump is obviously a racist and a fascist, and it's, like, supposed to be a straight news story. Today, they more objectively cover Trump and the right than they did in the 2010s. And there was just so much hysteria at that time. And it bled into, like, the hysteria over Charlottesville, hysteria over Southern Heritage, hysteria over later led to COVID. I think is that if you didn't have all that hysteria building up around Trump, I don't think you would have had as much COVID lockdown nonsense as well. I mean, that happened around the world, but around the world also felt Trump hysteria. So Mueller was definitely the embodiment of it, but people just don't remember it. But it was very cringe. I think the Chippendales, him as like I shared that of him like being super jacked in a Chippendales outfit. I was like, there's just like strange stuff at that time. There was so much cringe coming from libtard resistance, but it's all now forgotten. All there. It's like I always keep bringing up that Sally Cohn tweet. That's another thing that's like where it's like straightforward from here about how we're going to get President Clinton. And now all the Sally Cohn tweet, like people have completely forgot about Sally Cohn. Sally Cohn was like this lesbian Jewish liberal who I don't know what's happened to her now. I'm pretty sure she was lesbian. She had the short hair and like tried to present herself as masculine. Don't sue me if she's not, but I'm pretty sure she was. I've forgotten, completely forgot about Sally Cohn, but she was like a huge thing at that time. There was also these other people who were, some of the names I've forgotten about, who would just have these like blue anon conspiracy theories about like Trump being controlled by Russia, and they would have all these posts and would get like millions of views and get tons of traffic. Like Sarah Kenzor, I think, was one of them. There was a ton. Schindler, who is tweeted by a lot of right wingers, and he has like a lot of right wing takes, but he's obsessed with Russia. So he became a big resistance guy, even though people he had like tweets praising Evola. I forget his first name. It's like Schindler. I don't think it's Kurt Schindler. It's something Schindler. He also became a big figure, and all these guys became resistance. But a lot of that's now like gone to the right, or you can't determine which right or left with some of these conspiracy theories. So, but yeah, the idea that Russia controlled Trump is something that was fundamental to the entire left at the time, and they thought Mueller would prove it, and he disproved it, and it was a letdown, but they still carried on. But they don't want to. They want to pretend that they didn't believe this because it's very embarrassing for them. Now we've got a lot of questions about Cesar Chavez. New England refugee asked about it, and somebody else asked about it. Oh, Mark asked about it. Mark asked a longer question about it, so I'll read it. But New England refugees just asked for my thoughts on the cancellation by the left of him. And Mark asked, do you think that the reason the left could cancel him because of him once not liking illegals? I'm very skeptical of this. I'm skeptical of this as well. The right is more interested in his illegal thing. It was very brief in the 60s and 70s where we were not having that much of an illegal immigrant problem. By the time of his death, where we were having it as much bigger problem, he was pro-illegal immigrants because he realized that these were people who were going to join his unions and would be, part of his coalition for his goals. So he stopped being anti-illegal. The anti-illegal stuff, they're not canceling him because of that. Because when it mattered, when we're having a bigger issue, he was pro-illegal immigrant. When, the 60s and 70s, when he was organizing these campaigns to beat him up and to, treat him as scabs, they weren't that big of a problem. They became a bigger problem they were starting to become more of a problem in the 70s, and by the 80s, it, began to even be something more, something that we couldn't ignore. And he was pro it. No, that's not it. It's more that it's showing the power of Me Too. That it's still there. Is that sometimes I've wondered whether Me Too has been canceled, but this is a sign that it's still very powerful. And the sexual abuse of children is the one remaining. It's both Me Too and it's also a reaffirmation of the one taboo we have, sexual abuse of children. I think if it had been adult women saying, oh, well, maybe he sexually assaulted me or something, I don't think it would have been a swift cancellation. Because guess who else that applies to? Martin Luther King. And we're never going to cancel Martin Luther King. Well, I wouldn't say never, but it's much more unlikely. And even there was this I guess it was at a Georgia University or a Georgia high school where they had a March Madness bracket for ranking the best Americans. And MLK won out against Lincoln. He is still, unfortunately, he's still the most admired American. And I've always brought out this point is that when polling showed of the American figures that they think that there should be statues of, him and Lincoln are tied. He's more important than Thomas Jefferson and George Washington to modern Americans, sadly. So with Chavez, he's not as important as MLK. They've tried to make him into the Latino MLK, but first off, not that Hispanics are a diverse coalition because they're mostly tied to their nationality. And sometimes they're like, well, this guy's a Mexican. We don't care about him. We care about like our Cuban guy or Puerto Rican or Colombian. They care about their own particular nationality. They don't really. It's been very tough to have a universal Hispanic identity. They tried to make that with Cesar Chavez, but he was far less important than MLK. And it's a major taboo to be sexually abusing kids. major taboo. It's something that we still will cancel on. So it's actually it's something that, like, one thing the right was always predicting is like they're gonna normalize pedophilia. If anything, pedophilia is, which is I'm saying this is a good thing, is more forbidden and more condemned than it's ever been before. So yeah, and then Mark asked, he had a follow up, was like, does the cancellation of Cesar Chavez prove that woke is still around in some way? You could argue with me too, but I think it's just more that it's, if you become a pedophile, it becomes harder to defend. Now, the one thing to say is with Harvey Milk, but that is a gay man. And so the gay stuff, it's a little bit more uncomfortable because we don't want to confront that that issue. But that would be another way, because that's one way you could get Harvey Milk canceled. It would be if we found out MLK was having sex with a 15-year-old, you could also potentially undermine the MLK cult. But we haven't found that. I think it's all fully adult women. And he died before he was 40, so it wasn't that big of an age gap yet. So I don't think it wouldn't be that bad if they had it. It's like, oh, a 38-year-old with 22 doesn't have as much power. Maybe if he was like a 50-year-old man with a 22-year-old, maybe we could cancel him for pedophilia. But I don't know if that's going to happen. But Chavez, it's definitely the sexual abuse of children. The thing is that people don't want to admit is that this is insanely common among Hispanics. I remember when abortion was overturned and states started passing laws. I think it was in Indiana where this Hispanic girl had to go across state lines to get an abortion. And they're like, this is going to be the future of it. And I remember they interviewed the mother, and it was clearly like a live-in boyfriend who did it. And the mother was basically defending the live-in boyfriend because this is insanely common among Hispanics. It's also insanely common among blacks. It's like the sexual abuse of children is extremely common among them. Thinking about Kanye and his cousin, even though I think they were both minors, like the song he did about giving his cousin head, that's like very common among them. It's not common among us, even though sometimes it happens with white trash and other sorts. But the sexual abuse of children is something very common in their communities, and it's not surprising that Cesar Chavez was involved in it. But it is the one great taboo, and people aren't going to defend pedophilia. I think the instantaneous cancellation of it just showed that it was mostly propped up. Nobody really admired Cesar Chavez in the way that they admire a lot of these black civil rights leaders. He was just like, we need to have a Hispanic Martin Luther King. Okay, we have Cesar Chavez, but there wasn't that deep commitment to it. And some of the Hispanics, as they sort of become their own type of generic American, they're less committed to these figures, they themselves. And there's not really as much of a rallying force for that person, like there would be for Malcolm X, for Martin Luther King, John Lewis, Frederick Douglass, a lot of these other civil rights leaders. And even with Harvey Milk, like gays know that if they try to cancel him for pedophilia, that this would be an attack on their community, and they would rally around Harvey Milk. Hispanics just don't care that much enough about Cesar Chavez to rally behind him. It was propped up and mostly a fake admiration and cult around him, and it immediately got toppled when he was found of violating the one remaining social taboo we have. So I don't know if it was really woke. It's more that it shows kind of the weakness of Hispanics trying to build up their own type of black identity or similar identity to black identity and having their own heroes, is that they're not even that committed to their own heroes. Is that blacks would rally around their figures under attack. They even do that with modern figures that are attacked. And it's the same with gays when they would rally behind Harvey Milk as their MLK. But Hispanics just don't care that much about Cesar Chavez to do so. And people don't want to defend a pedophile. So I don't think it's so much as woke is around it. It is kind of Stalin-esque, and I think it is amusing how they're eliminating him, but I just think it's like no one was really that like invested in Chavez in the first place. And that's why it got canceled. It's like, well, why do we have this guy? He's a pedophile. And it was only just something that was like thrown in to have like our own Hispanic MLK, but no one really admired him in the same way. And once he's found out to be a pedophile, immediately there's a stronger taboo against that than any time in the past. Like, I think if this had been found out 20 or 30 years ago, they wouldn't have had the immediate cancellation of it, but there would have been some gradual backing off of Chavez maybe, or have been just a forgotten fact or disputed fact about him. But today, it's instantaneous. There's all the hoopla around Epstein. The left is more into this now and running a run on the Epstein class and all these pedophiles running our government. And then to have one of their figures that they've only propped up as like, a token MLK, and Hispanics don't even really care for him that much, they immediately cancel him. So that's my thoughts. I wouldn't say it's so much woke. It's just something very peculiar to it. And I don't really say it's woke to be like upset about sexually abusing young girls. I don't think that's so much it. There is a Me Too aspect about it, but it's the fact that that's different because they're minors. I think if it had been a 22-year-old woman, there would have been, just debates over whether we should still have a Cesar Chavez Day and stuff, but they wouldn't have immediately just like changed these street names and plazas and started discussing taking down statues and immediately halting this stuff. It's over pedophilia and the fact that there's not as much strong support for him among Hispanics. Hispanics just don't give a shit about their leaders, and they're not as united as a front, and they don't have as this very distinct culture over time because, it's divided by nationality as blacks do. So it was mostly fake, and I think it got exposed as fake. So we'll go to, I think Gillis Enjoyer had another question. Well, James had a question about Mueller. He said, in light of Trump's comments about Bob Mueller, many pre-Trump conservatives are disgusted with his comments, but any of these guys have no fight in them at all, regardless if it's about Mueller. The lawfare lawsuits, etc. What drives this branch of conservatism to always think it's noble to have dirt kicked in your face and not respond? He's got two questions, but we'll go with the Mueller thing. Mueller, there's so much other things going on right now that I don't think people cared about the Mueller response. And I actually think it's more warranted than Rob Reiner. This is a guy who tried to ruin Trump, the lives of his family, his associates, his allies, and the movement over a lie. And I think it's fine for Trump to just say, I don't give a shit about him. I think and it's short and sweet, and it's more warranted than Rob Reiner. Rob Reiner was just a random libtard who was attacking Trump. He didn't have any real negative effects on Trump. Mueller was a guy who was trying to ruin Trump's life and throw him in jail over a lie, and those of his friends and over his family and allies. And I think, I still think it's nice to speak, don't speak ill of the dead. Should follow that norm, but I think it's more warranted Rob Reiner. There's so many other things going on that it's not as much as the Rob Reiner thing. I thought the Rob Reiner thing, it was probably wrong, but it was still really funny in a degree. I think it's just that it's not pre-Trump conservatism saying like, oh, we like to lose, we like to be civil. It's more that it's a norm to not speak ill of the dead. It's we want to uphold these norms, and it's tawdry to violate them. I think Trump, I would probably say he shouldn't have said those things about Rob Reiner, even though I found it very amusing and funny when he did. But Mueller, I think it's more warranted. And what do you expect him to say? I think it's better for him to have said that than to be like, oh, we honor a fallen hero. That's bullshit. That's bullshit. He shouldn't have said that. I think it's fine with him saying about Mueller, but I'm not surprised pre-Trump conservatives are like that. They're not so much upholding like a loser conservatism. It's more that they're upholding common norms, but in this situation, it's less warranted or less. There's more justification for Trump's response than it was with Rob Reiner. So, yeah, I don't think it's that. It's not surprising that they're disgusted with it, but what do you expect? He's also has a question about, I've been reading on why conservatives create art, and there's a debate on X about it. It's been an endless debate about it. I've heard several theories. One is that conservatives are shut out of cultural institutions, but when they do make art, they make Angel Studio pictures and Daily Wire girl boss movies. I'm curious about your thoughts on it. Well, I've had a lot of thoughts on it. It's just that there's not an audience for conservative art or the art that like online right wants. And online right doesn't even know what art they want. Some people, they want like new metal and they want Xbox back and they want just like trash 2000s culture back. That's not art. Others, they just, they want like old school too. Others, they want some like avant-garde thing, or they want Wagner, or they want something traditionally Catholic. There's no a shared assumption of what they want as great art, besides like showing some 19th century paintings. That's it. And classical architecture. That's the only common things. But our audience, like the Trump supporters, have terrible sense of aesthetics. Like, look at MAGA, look at Turning Point USA, and I'm pro these things, but they have terrible aesthetics. But that's what our audience likes. It's the same with Yellowstone and the Taylor Sheridan stuff. They want the Taylor Sheridan stuff. They want the Angel Studios cheese. They do not want like whatever great art is imagined by the online right. They simply want some rant. They want the slop. Okay? And with even the people who are like, well, that shouldn't be determining what we create in great art. Well, like conservatives, you have to have an audience for it. And it's like, who's paying for this? But a lot of people just want billionaires to fund some stupid avant-garde project that they have that's not even fucking good. And then they do it, and then it's put out there, and no one enjoys it. And it doesn't create anything. It's like, well, why aren't they doing my like avant-garde dance show or something? But no one wants that. No one wants that. There's no shared assumption of what they want in art. Also, we're a political movement. We're not an artistic movement. We don't have creative types creative types of a way that you would imagine with art movement. But even with right, we've created culture through memes. And it's had a major political impact, and it's what's enjoyed by people today. It's like the way people traditionally consumed art and culture is very different now than it is today. Most people are consuming short form videos on TikTok and YouTube. They're sharing memes. They don't even Zoomers don't even have the attention span for a full length movie. So what kind of culture do you want to create? And in terms of the culture that people are consuming on an hourly basis, we are creating that culture. But it's it's temporary and fleeting, and it's not like the highbrow culture that some grand opera or epic movie, it's not like that, or some great novel. People don't fucking read either. So it's like, our side doesn't read. Like the right wingers who are like, we need to create great culture. They're like, fuck books. Books are for dorks. Oh, I'm not reading books. So, this is what you're having to deal with. Even within the online right, the culture they want is not like some highbrow stuff. They just want like a new metal song about how 40 is the new 18, so that's that. So it's to outline the things. One, our audience doesn't want conservative art. They want Angel Studios and Taylor Sheridan and, hip hop. Second, the people who want art don't have an idea of what art they want to create. They just, post classical architecture and 19th century paintings. And those are basically the two. And three is we're a political movement, not a creative movement. We're not a cultural movement. We're a political movement, and you're not going to imagine like Republican politicians like starting to finance like movies and stuff. And four is and this is particular with Zoomers, is that people don't even consume, even in general, the young people we're trying to win over, they're not consuming the type of cultural output that people imagine. They're consuming cultural output we're already producing. So that's my answers to that. Gillis Enjoyer had another question, which we'll now get to. He said, do you think we're going to end up having the SAVE Act passed or not? We're not going to pass it, unfortunately, because they don't have the votes to pass it through the filibuster. Even if they did the talking filibuster, they're not going to have Republicans stick to it. And there's so many things they need to pass. It's now a huge deal to fund DHS, which Trump has said that they're going to, all other business, he's not going to sign until they get DHS funded. But if they do this talking filibuster, this is going to further impact the funding for DHS. And Americans are pissed about the TSA lines. And over the weekend, there's like random airports in like New Orleans and elsewhere where the line is out in Atlanta, is the line is out into the parking lot. People are pissed about this. This is like something that they experience on their daily lives. People see videos about this. This makes them angry. And they're not going to shut down all business when everyone's having to be like 5 hours in TSA line. Okay. Maybe ICE will solve that, but who knows? It's more about the funding for DHS that is there, and they just don't have the votes to over. They can do the talking filibuster, but they don't have the votes to go along with the filibuster. They have the votes to just pass it or to vote for it, but it's going to fail with the normal filibuster. But then if they go with the talking filibuster, they don't have the votes for that, because there's going to be a lot of the moderate Republicans who are going to vote to overturn the filibuster. And that's just it. It doesn't seem like Cornyn is going to be there. And Cornyn himself doesn't seem to be getting Trump's endorsement, because Trump knows that Paxton's going to win and he doesn't want to back a loser. So there's that. No, the SAVE Act is probably not going to be passed. As I've been saying, is that they don't have the votes to support the bill with the talking filibuster, which is what the measure they want to do. And it's not even clear that even if they do the talking filibuster, that Republicans will keep up the pressure. Because, if they shut down business, they're already not doing anything. But if they shut down business for another month and we still haven't funded DHS, they're, and the TSA lines are longer, and there's the war business that they're going to have to, have votes on and debates on, Republicans aren't going to stick with it. Unfortunately, they could just eliminate the filibuster, but they don't have the votes for that. So they're in a pickle. So I don't think we're going to have the SAVE Act passed. I think they'll have a vote on it, and then they won't have the filibuster, and then people will attack each other and blame Thune. So that's it. But and Republicans leadership want Trump to back Cornyn, and they would try to weigh, but they can't get these guys, they can't twist the arms of these Republicans who are skittish about overturning the filibuster, the normal filibuster, or the filibuster that we've had, to, go along with this. So yeah, it's not gonna. I don't think it's gonna be passed, unfortunately. People say like what time? They're the only way it could is if they tie it to like funding bill, which they've talked about, but that's probably the only way it could get passed. But I don't think Democrats are in a much stronger position to do so. They really should have tied the SAVE Act to something else maybe in the first year if they would have had. But even then, I'm skeptical it could have been passed. You just don't have enough votes for it. And you don't have enough Republicans willing to stick with it. So it's unfortunate. It would be great if we had it. It would definitely help us in elections and help the country. But it's too good for Congress to pass, unfortunately. So that's my thoughts on that. We'll go with K-Max. K-Max asked me about Chuck Norris and like some liberals saying, his politics are going to overshadow his death. Which show or movie was his number one? I thought the Chuck Norris stuff was actually really lame. My grandmother was really into Walker, Texas Ranger. So as a teenager, I began watching ironically, I guess a millennial thing. It was very enjoyable to watch ironically because it's an extremely stupid show. But generally liking any Chuck Norris movie or show, no. It's fine to admire Chuck Norris. I don't... it's great, American, but I would say his movies and shows were actually good. Walker, Texas Ranger was so bad it's enjoyable to watch, at least when I was like a teenager. But I don't know what today if I would like it. People don't like that type of ironic watching shows anymore because people are like, we're all anti-irony. But now it's like Zoomer's just like pure nihilism. It's not like any placing with any sincerity, which they think that they're replacing it with, or earnestness, but they're not going to watch these things ironically. But that would be my main memory of Chuck Norris, is Walker, Texas Ranger. And so RIP to Chuck Norris. Renown has a question. He asks, so one of your more original and arguably more accurate takes is that young men should read history rather than, say, philosophy. If a clueless 18, 21, or 25-year-old wanted to take that advice seriously, which 3 or 5, 10 works would you most recommend? 3, 5, 10. Dude, don't ask for 10 works. Man, ask for 3. I don't know. It's just getting a basic view of history. So I would go, actually, if you're going to recommend works, go to the Oxford History of the United States, because people don't know shit about the United States. So I have a whole book recommendations of American history, and I think with most of our guys, they don't understand American history, and this is very basic American history they should learn. It's not that woke. I recommend reading the Oxford History of the United States, and it has multiple. You got the Glorious Cause about the American Revolution. You got Empire of Liberty about early 19th century America, what hath God wrought, about the Jacksonian era. Then you've got Battle Cry of Freedom, which is about the Civil War era. You got the Reconstruction era. Then you've got the World War II one about fear. I forget the name. I have it around here somewhere. I probably can just see it. Hold on. Freedom from Fear. Actually, I'm looking over to my bookshelf. I now see it. Freedom from Fear. That's a good one. And then the one about the post-war era, post-World War II era, which is good. Forget that name, unfortunately. And also, very much important, the diplomatic history of the war, which I'm going to pull up, which is very good. Actually, if I would recommend one of that, it would be the George Herring book on American foreign policy, which would be From Colony of Superpower. That would be the one I would recommend, because most people don't know how American foreign policy works, and it's purely based on fantasy. So that'd be it. That's American history. For generic history, broader topic, it's not that you just have to read a lot with that. You have to just read constantly. There's not even it's unfortunate that there's not 1 or 2 good books about world history. I would actually say Post-War by Tony Jute is actually a good one about post-war Europe. Actually, I would say that it's a good generic explanation. Pre-war Europe, unfortunately, there's not a really good one of explaining the last 500 years. But that would be it. So that would be close to 10 works that I would recommend. Primarily about American history, though. Because you have to get the generic overviews. There's some more into the meat, but people need to establish themselves with a basic sense of knowledge. And the Oxford History of the United States gives you that. And post-war, I think, also gives you an accurate explanation of what post-war Europe is like, which is maybe not as important to world affairs, but it gives you a perspective of what Europe is like now. So that is my opinion. Now we got a new guy. Sacker House Enjoyer asked, he said, after spending several years in a major cosmopolitan hub, I recently moved to a rural community, and within weeks, I've seen more transgender people here than I ever did in the city. Since bohemian bourgeois beliefs and aesthetics seem to be eventually drift downward into lower class rural America, should we be white-pilled that corrosive ideologies are being offloaded into dead-end communities with declining fertility rates? Do you see this trend continuing in the future? I don't know if I would see that as a white pill. No, there's this new article, it was in the New Atlantis or some new publication about the weirding of rural America. And it's very much true is that you see the weirder trends more in the heartland than you do in the major metropolitan areas. Most of the major metropolitan areas, you just see adults. And most adults are dressed like adults. They're going to work, they're there. So they're not as so much as bug hives. And it's the funny thing is people imagine oh, they're all weak and they don't have the strength of a rural America. And then it's if you go to DC at 5 o'clock, everyone is running. Everyone is outside. Everyone's doing physical activity. It's even the same on a Saturday. It's people are just running. They're all outside, physical activity. They're eating healthy. Meanwhile, if you go to, a rural area 2 hours outside of it, you're going to go to the nearest Walmart and you're going to see people in their roller scooters or their motor scooters and stuff. You're not going to see a lot of health there. And I think you're just more inclined to see decline in rural areas because you don't You don't, there's fewer people there, and there's no way of hiding it. And these people are locked into the internet. Like, everyone has access to the internet. And, maybe compared to major cosmopolitan areas, they don't have, the same level of understanding of what's cool or not. But everyone is like, everything gets reached at the same time. It's not quite like in the 80s and 90s, like, let's say, like music subcultures. You would have to live in an area where you're having concerts and stuff. So it would only be mainly established in the major hubs where certain subcultures would exist. Like, it required an extreme effort to be like a goth in rural Tennessee in like 1992, or even a metalhead, where that was a little bit more common. As it's harder to get hold of those records, harder to get hold. There's no concerts coming your way. There's no one else like that, and things are more delayed. I think today everything's instantaneous because everyone has access to the internet, and maybe compared to like the major suburbs where there's a greater social assimilation to it of deciding what's normal, what's not. It's like they're more experienced with it. With the rural areas, they just like, wow, they find out about something and then they just go with it. It's just like online straight to people doing this. There's no mediating effect compared to the major cosmopolitan hubs. And it's also why I think that's also why people turn into hick libs more in these areas, is that they associate all the kind of like dumb parochial behavior with the conservatives, and thus they go full left in a lot of ways if you have any different interests from those around you. So there's that. I wouldn't say we're white pilled. It's more of a black pill about how these corrosive ideologies are now in the heartland. And it's also, you're more likely to experience like the effects of demographic change in rural America now than you are in the suburbs. And even a lot of these major cities too. You're more likely to experience the effects because now they're planting these like Hispanics and Indians all over the place. So I would not take that as white pill. I would say it's a black pill. But maybe you could say is that the suburbs are less affected by that, and that's a white pill. But it's also a black pill that this is now affecting the heartland. But it's more than these like fantasies we have of the heartland where they're preserving like heritage American culture and they all have a strong identity as being heritage American. It's just like fake. You're also more inclined to experience like interracial couples now in like rural areas than you would in a certain major cosmopolitan areas. Now, certain pairings you might not see there, but you're also more inclined to just see a lot of the effects of the decline. And so I would take that more as a black pill. But the white pill is that it's not like everywhere else. Is that the suburbs, the nice areas where there's high income, still stand as utopias. The problem with those people is that life is so good that they are able to ignore these problems. I think with rural areas, you're no longer able to ignore these problems and you get more worked up. And I think that's also where these social pathologies are now starting to bleed into poison rural America, is why they're so right-wing among the older people, is that they experience a decline much more directly than anywhere else in the country. Let's see who else we have. We haven't gotten Arm Day Enjoyer yet. Did LK Rurik send his questions? No, we're missing LK Rurik. LK Rurik, if you can hear us, where are you? LK Rurik, for some reason, did not send questions today. But we'll conclude on Arm Day Enjoyer instead. I'll check. We got most of everyone. We got Gillis Enjoyer, Nitro, Mark, all the rest. So we're now down just to Arm Day Enjoyer. So Arm Day Enjoyer has two questions. He said the other day made some negative comments on mixed marriages, and my dad said to me that mixed race people shouldn't bother with their identity and just focus on their functional work. Bills on, well, he meant work, bills, staying out of trouble, basically saying our intermarriage isn't a big deal. So how would you argue that identity matters to normies? Oh, it doesn't matter to normies. Well, maybe on an instinctual level, like older people still find it weird, but they also don't. They want to just go along and focus on life. They're like, we got the big game, we got work, I've got a vacation plan. That's what they're focused on. They're focused on individual concerns. They're not focused on big picture. And like having a problem with mixed marriages, that means it's just another problem they're going to have to deal with. And people might frown on them and view them as a racist. So they would just choose to say, well, they should just focus on important things. Work, bills, staying out of trouble. It's a very individualistic mindset where everyone just should be focused on extremely pragmatic utilitarian concerns. Because that's what a lot of white Americans are like. Is that they're white Americans, what defines them is individualism and utilitarianism. Is that everyone should just be focused on getting a home, having, not these things are bad. These things are actually good. It's like having a home, having a family, having a good job, planning for retirement, planning for a vacation. That's what they should be able to focus on. Shouldn't focus on like what their identity is that they're too busy to focus on identity. And that's the case for a lot of middle American whites. So it doesn't matter to them. And for a lot of people, for a lot of the basis of identity is their attachment to culture, their attachment to language. If they still watch the same sports, if they still speak the same language, which they mostly do, then they're like, well, they're American. And also they have the citizenship papers. It becomes a difference with, in Europe where there's a distinct ethnocultural identity that's extremely difficult to assimilate to. American identity, as it's made today, as it's separated from its Anglo-Saxon roots, is much easier to assimilate into America's mass culture. And their real issue with mixed race people is, they shouldn't focus on identity because whites don't fixate on identity. What they're focused on, the average middle American white is just focused on their work. These are important things to focus on, but they don't care about anything else. It's very utilitarian, pragmatic concerns. So I think over time that this stuff's going to matter to them more as we become a minority, but it's not. In a lot of places, it's still everyone's white. It's the norm. It's the generic person. They don't have to think about these things. But I think over time, they're going to have to think about these things. The second question is, why can't people look at Trump's 2016 campaign trail comments on foreign policy with nuance and stop cherry picking? He's a Jacksonian hawk. Well, it is true with like the betrayal of the base. It's not really quite true. Is that, he's talking about bombing the shit out of ISIS. And he was wanting to get tougher on Iran than Obama. So these aren't quite... Well, it is a violation because he said he wouldn't have an Iran war and we're at a war with Iran. But in terms of being tougher on Iran and being willing to use more aggressive means in foreign policy, this is in keeping with even what he said in 2016 and certainly what he said in 2024. But people want to imagine they ran as a dove, which... Compared to Hillary Clinton, who was more hawkish, yes. Compared to Kamala, I don't know. Well, they were responsible for Ukraine, and Trump has been more willing to make a deal on Ukraine than they have. And I think if Trump has been president, we wouldn't have had the Ukraine war. Both for right and wrong reasons. It's like, one, Trump did not have the power to get us out of Afghanistan. The deep state made up Russian bounties and was making up a lot of other stuff, and he was much more beholden to like Mitch McConnell, the established Republican Party, in his first term, and that would have continued with the second term than he is now. So we wouldn't have got out of Afghanistan, but that was a real signal to Putin that like, oh, okay, maybe I should go there. And also Putin would have realized that he was much more taken in by the deep state, that he had less freedom to maneuver on that matter. Is that Putin went into Ukraine because he thought that Biden was retreating from an empire, and he was wrong on that. But he's not like a non-interventionist. He's not a neoconservative at all because he doesn't care about spreading liberal democracy. And he's less committed to, he wanted to pull out of Afghanistan, unlike a lot of conservatives. And he's been more critical of some of these measures, but he's also wants to build a legacy of creating a more Trumpian world. And he feels he has more power to do these things in foreign sphere than he does in domestic, so he went with it. But it didn't work out. The betrayal of the base is like tied to him a personality. we are not representing the base. We're representing certain constituents of the base, or we're speaking for them. In some ways, some of these people are speaking for independence, but we do not speak for the base. It was a mistake the alt-right made in the 2010s, and it's a mistake we're making now. The difference is the alt-right, there was no audience for that, for anti-Trump base talk like that. Now there's a huge audience for that. And if you're an influencer, you're more incentivized to be anti-Trump than you are to be pro-Trump. Very different from what it was like in the 2010s. So that is my thoughts on that. So the thing is like people can't be honest. And also everyone forgets the recent past. The 2010s are just completely forgotten right now. I think it's politically useful for anti-Trump right-wingers. It's politically useful for liberals. It's just useful for most people to forget. And MAGA is not going to remember the 2010s either. So everyone wants to forget about it. And it's the same with his 2016 campaign trail. And now we imagine that Trump ran as a Nazi in 2016 when, in fact, he didn't. And actually, his 2024 campaign was much more right-wing, or not much more right-wing, but more right-wing in 2024 than it was in 2016. In 2016, he didn't ever explicitly call for legal immigration restriction. In 2024, he did. And in 2024, he ran on mass deportations now and a lot of other things. His campaign was much more right-wing, but people, there's a bigger audience for black pills and wanting to be anti-Trump now, so people want to imagine it was more, left-wing. His 2020 campaign was not very right-wing, but we were still supportive of it. So that is it for Highly Respected this week. We'll be back with more great content later this week, so be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.